All right. So we talk a little bit in here about feeding the story when the story's over, but we're going to feed this one before it starts a little bit here.
So I hear people's voices outside in the cafeteria, so if we can start getting folks coming back in so we can get to the story and not have too much disruption there. Thank you.
So this story comes from this continent, from North America, from Turtle Island. It doesn't come exactly from this land, but it comes from land that's not very far away, really. From eastern Wisconsin. From the people of that land that call themselves the Mamacheta. And that land also happens to be the land where I was born. I was born on Mamacheta land. And about 2 months ago, I laid my father's remains to rest in that land, near the shores of that big lake, Michigan. So that land is holy to me. Many of the people, including my people, have a story of having migrated to that land, but the Mamacheta story is that they emerged from that land, were created there in that place. About 125 years ago, they shared the story we're going to call out today with a white man so that he could write it down, because that story was in danger of disappearing from this world. They put it in the seed of written language. Today, we ask their permission to plant that seed again in the moist hearts and the fertile consciousness and the souls of these men here. So there was a time when the Mamacheta, the people who are known by a name called them by different people, they are known by the name of the wild rice people, the Menominee, or as we say it, the Menominee. Those people, the people of two wigwams, were living in a forest. They were living in a forest, and this is how they lived. There was a hunter who would provide the things of this world and bring them back to his lodge. And with him, there was a woman, his wife, and she would use that woman's magic to transform those things of the world into nurturance and into shelter and into clothing and all the things that we need to live. And of course, in the way of those things, with a man and his wife and a lodge and the things of the world, well, there were little children that came along too. Little brown-eyed berry eaters. Things were pretty good. There was game in those woods. The sturgeon would come up the stream, provide the flesh of fish. But there was an issue. Whenever they let the children out to play, they kept close watch on them, and they didn't let them go far. You see, there was a rumor, a legend, a myth. And the myth went that there was a witch that lived in those woods. And she had a way of luring children to her. And the children would disappear. Now the people would go out looking for them. They would send their best trackers, and they would send their dogs. And they would send all the people combing through the woods, following that trail. But that trail of that missing child always ran cold and disappeared. And those children were never seen again. That was the story. That was the old wives' tale. And like a lot of myths and legends and stories and old wives' tales, this one was pretty much dead on true. There was an old woman in those woods. And what she would do is she had a ball, an object of great power, of great medicine, a sphere, an orb. And she would take this ball and she could send it out anywhere in the world that she wanted it to go. And when it got to a village, if a child saw that, why, he or she had to have it. The child would go for that ball, this object of great power. They would reach for it, and when they did, the ball would roll back just out of their reach. The child, of course, would reach for it again, but the ball again would just stay tantalizingly close to the edge of their fingers, but not allow itself to be grasped. And the ball would start rolling back and lead that child back to the lodge of that old woman in the woods. Well, one day, the old woman took that ball of power and she rolled it out toward the Menominee, toward the people of Two Wigwams, the place where they were living. And sure enough, there was a boy there doing what boys do, messing about. He saw that thing, he saw that ball, and he had to have it. He reached for that thing, but it led away from him. It was just out of his grasp. He tried again, he kept trying, he had to have it, and the more he tried, the more he wanted it. But it kept moving, and he followed it and followed it and followed it until it took him back to the lodge of the old woman. And the ball went right into the lodge and the boy with it. And the old woman said, "Hello, grandson." And she offered him some food. They sat there and they ate. They talked a little bit, maybe in a way that you did at your grandmother's house. Maybe she gave you some food sometime. The old woman talked with him for a bit. And after a while, she said, "Tell me, grandson, have you ever fasted? Have you ever fasted and prayed and called for the Manadoos, the spirits, to come to you and to share their power with you? Have you ever done that, boy?" And he said, No, I've never fasted." And she said, "Would you like to try?" And the boy agreed that he would like to try that, to fast and to call upon the Manadoos, the spirits, to share their power with him. And so he sat himself down on some robes there in the side of the lodge, and he began his fast. The boy fasted for 10 days, a good long fast. And then the old woman brought him food and water, and he broke his fast, and he revived himself. And the old woman said, "Grandson, tell me, surely the Manadoos came to you. Surely they all came and they shared their power with you." And the boy said, "Some of them came. Some of them shared their power. But others stayed away and would not come." And the old woman said, "Well, then you must fast on." So the boy sat down again and began another fast. He fasted for another 10 days. And the old woman came again with food and water. But this time, the boy turned his face to the wall and continued his fast, this time for a total of 20 days. The old woman came again with food and water, and he broke his fast. He ate a little bit. He revived himself. The old woman said, "Surely now all of the Manadoos have come to you. Surely they have shared their power with you. You fasted for a long time, grandson." And he said, "Many more have come and shared their power, but some Manadoos still stay away from me." And the old woman said, "Well, then you must fast more." And so the boy turned his face to the wall and he fasted again. This time, he fasted for 50 days. There was so little life left in him that the old woman was not really sure whether he was alive or dead. But after 50 days, she leaned her old cheek down near his mouth and his nose. And on the side of that old cheek, she could feel the faintest stirrings of breath. And she brought him a little watery food and put it on his lips. And slowly, slowly, she revived him and brought him back from the edge. And once again the old woman said, "Now, grandson, have all the Manidoos come to you, and have they shared their power with you?" And this time the boy said, "They have all come to me now, and they have shared their power." The boy went out into the woods after he'd revived his strength, and he made for himself a spear and a war club and a bow and some arrows. And these were powerful weapons, weapons imbued with great medicine and great power by the Manidoos. They also gave the boy incredible perception, powers of sight and hearing and knowledge. And the Manidoos also gave him the power to change his shape into any kind of way of being he needed to. His grandmother came to him and she said, "Many other boys have come here. I've brought many boys here and they've fasted. And I've done this because there is a bad one in the world. There's a bad one who lives out in the world far away. He lives across a roaring river, a great rapids. His lodges are there on the other side. And I've sent the boys there. That bad one has in his possession some gold. And he has a wonderful little bridge that he can extend across any chasm, across any span, and so he can travel easily. And that's how he gets over those rapids and into this world. And what I want you to do is to find that one, that bad one, and I want you to steal some of the gold. And I want you to get that little bridge and bring it back to me. But I must warn you, I've sent many boys out there to do that, and none of them has ever returned." And she said one further thing. To get across that rapids, I'll give you that ball that you followed here. And when you get to those rapids and you see the lodges of the bad one on the other side, you tie that ball to your leg, and it will enable you to walk on the water over those raging rapids and get to the other side. And the boy agreed that he would try to get the gold and the bridge. And the next day, he took up his weapons of power, and he slung that ball on his back, and he started walking. He walked a long time, or a short time, until he came to a roaring rapids, a river with more power than he could even imagine. He'd never seen anything like this. He picked up a stick and threw it into that water, and though his eyes were more keen than that of any hawk or even eagle, that stick was gone so fast in that powerful water that it was out of sight in an instant.
So he sat there, contemplating this raging river. And remembering the instructions that the old woman had given him, he took that ball and he tied it to his right foot. Now imagine this, a river so powerful, so great, that it would defy any perception at its speed. And he took his first tentative step onto the water and immediately sprang back. Then he took another tentative step. You know, the kind like you step on brittle ice to see if it may hold you? And he took another one. and leapt back again, fear taking hold of his heart. And finally, a third time, he stepped again onto the water of that raging river and made one step after another until finally he had reached the other side. Sweating, shaking. You know the kind like Tim talked about where your knees are moving. He knelt down and untied that magic ball, that wonderful ball, and put it in a knapsack on his back. Took up his weapons and began carefully making his way to the top of a hill. And on top of that hill, he could look down and see the huts of the bad one. And with his keen sight, he looked and took in the entire scene, noticing that there was a hut off to one side that contained food. And seeing the main hut, the main lodge, he could look inside and he saw there a great, obese, fat being sitting in the middle of a room. And on the rafters of that hut were bags of gold. And off in the corner, in one side, hidden somewhat on a little table, was the wonderful little bridge. And taking in this scene, the boy noticed that this bad one would sit in the middle of this hut and not go anywhere. He remained there, guarding his treasures. And then the evil one would look around, and he noticed that he would grumble, and out of the food hut would come a woman, a servant woman, lung woman. And she would bring him food and keep him fed. And so the boy wondered, he looked on this scene and wondered, how is it that I'll be able to get this fat one out of there so that I can sneak in and steal a little bit of that gold and get that wonderful bridge? And then it occurred to him to call on the Manados to make the bad one so hungry that he could not stand to stay in there but must go for food. And in that instant, the bad one cried out in a bellowing voice, "Woman, bring me food! I'm famished! I'm starving!" And she leapt up and began to go towards the hut. And he lifted his bulk, unable to wait one instant more for the food that was awaiting him, and staggered to the doorway. And standing on the doorway, Lung Woman turned right around, came back, took his arm, and off they went to the food hut to feed that empty gullet that he experienced in that moment. And with that, the boy snuck quickly and carefully down to the hut, made his way inside, took in everything that he could see, blankets in the corner, the wonderful little bridge on a table, and up in the rafters, the bags of gold. And he reached up and took one of those bags, just one, and put it underneath his left arm. He quickly made his way to the corner and took the wonderful little bridge and put it in underneath his right arm. And then perceiving that if he were to try to escape in that moment, his tracks would be seen and he would be instantly captured by the bad one, and this mission would be over. And so looking around the room, he spied the pile of bedding and robes. And taking a sharp knife, he took one of the robes and made a slit in it, caused himself to be very skinny and small, and crawled into the slit inside of the robes and hid there. Well, the moment that he had taken the bag of gold from the rafters, it had upset the precarious balance, and other bags began dropping. And as they did, they made noise. And Lung Woman heard this noise, and she took the bad man and shook him and said, "There's something going on in the hut. We must go." And they turned around and quickly made their way back. And as they turned a corner, they saw bags of gold landing on the floor, and the bad one cried out, "There's been a thief! A thief! Look for the tracks!" And outside, Lung Woman circled the entire hut, circled everywhere, and could not find any tracks. And she came back and she said, "There are no tracks." The thief must be inside here. And they began, the two of them, tearing everything apart, looking beneath the bedding, underneath the cot, behind the table, everywhere, and nowhere was anything to be found. And they began to carefully put things back in their appropriate places, and it was then that Lung Woman noticed the slit in the robe, and she snuck a bony hand in there and drew out the boy and stood him in the middle of the room. And the bad one towered over him. "Are you the thief that has taken my treasure?" And noticing the backpack, he said, "You must be a ball carrier." And the boy said, "Yes, I'm the thief." And Lung Woman stepped forward and she said, "Where have you hidden the gold?" And he lifted up his left arm, indicated his armpit. And Lung Woman reached to her belt and slid out a long dagger. Shiny blade, a glint on the edge like a diamond. Took his wrist, lifted it up, and taking that blade, slid it carefully along the skin, removing every particle of gold. Then she said, "And where is the wonderful bridge?" And he lifted his right arm, and she took that same knife, took him by the wrist, lifted it up into the air, and slid that diamond sharp knife along the skin until the bridge was removed. And putting the treasures back in their place, the bad one turned and said, "Lung Woman, it's time for a feast. Why don't you wash and prepare this insignificant creature for our meal, and I will go find the water monsters, our friends, and we'll have a feast." And as Lung Woman took the ball carrier and began leading him out of the hut, he turned to her and he said, "Wait a minute, I have a proposition. I am so skinny, there's hardly any bones or fat on me at all. If you will feed me well for 2 days, I will fatten up very nicely and make a much better feast." And Lung Woman, hearing this and noticing the thinness of this boy, turned to the evil one and told him what the ball carrier had said. And he turned and looked at the two of them and he said, "Well, why not? A fat meal is much better than a skinny one." And with that, the Lung Woman took the ball carrier out to the food hut, to the pen behind, tied him up, and began feeding him. And he ate and he ate, and he grew fatter and fatter until finally he was so fat he could barely turn his head. And at the end of the 2 days, the evil one came and said, "It's time for the meal. Prepare the great pot, fill it with water, and put this creature inside that we might have a fine feast, and I will go get the water monsters and will return soon. However, under no circumstances should you take a sip of that broth, for you will surely defile it." And with that, the evil one took off and wandered down the way until he find the water monsters. And Lung Woman hefted the great cauldron out, put it on the fire, built coals underneath, filled it full of water, and the water began boiling with great big balls of air and heat and steam. And then she went to the ball carrier and brought him to the edge. And now ball carrier, he called on the Manados, the spirit beings, to make that water the only temperature of a bath, but to keep it roiling as though it were boiling. And she hefted him inside, and he began bobbing around the cauldron, his head poking up this way and that, bumping on the edges. And the fat that the Manados had provided him began boiling to the surface. And a savory smell began permeating the area, began roiling slowly around that wonderful, savory, tasty smell of fine food. And ball carrier, from his position, peering just out of the water, called the Lung Woman and said, "Wouldn't you like a taste?" And Lung Woman, looking over her shoulder and not seeing the bad one, took up a ladle, reached out very far and took just a little drop, and she put it to her lips. And a beatific expression came to her face at the wonderful savory flavor. And Ball Carrier said to her, "Why don't you come a little closer and take more?" She stepped close. She reached her ladle into the water. And in that moment, Ball Carrier grabbed hold of her and caused the great cauldron to spill over the top of her, spilling that incredibly hot, boiling, fat water over the top of her. And she died, scalded in that moment. Now Ball Carrier, returning himself back to his normal shape, whisked himself right back to that lodge, taking one of the bags of gold and putting it underneath his left arm, taking hold of that bridge, putting it underneath his right arm, made his way quickly to the river. When he reached the edge of the river, he took out that wonderful bridge, put his arm out and said, "Bridge, be long!" Stretched itself all the way across that river, and he scampered right across to the other side. And when he reached the other side, he grabbed hold of that wonderful bridge and said, "Bridge, be small." And it brought itself back inside, and he put it underneath his right arm once again, and he sat there. It wasn't long before the bad one came back, and behind him were a collection of the water monsters, all prepared for the feast to be. Well, what Ball Carrier had done was set fire to the hut before he had left, and it had burned so hot that there was absolutely nothing left. And when the evil one began looking around for his place, there was nothing there. But seeing out of the clearing there, he could see the tracks heading towards the river, so he raced to the edge of the river. And when he arrived there, he spied on the other side Ball Carrier sitting on the shore. And in that moment, he knew what had happened. He turned to the water monsters and he said, "There will be no feast today."
No feast.
No feast.
Rip off.
And when they left, he turned back and called across the river and he said, "Ball Carrier, you have undone me. You have taken my treasures. You have burned my dwelling. I have nothing left. Let me offer you this. I will come into your service. I will let you lead me through the world, and I will do whatever you ask, if you will just extend the wonderful bridge across and bring me over." And Ball Carrier thought for a moment. And he said, "I can agree to this." Took out the wonderful bridge, extended across the river. And the evil one began climbing. And as he reached the apex of the bridge, Ball Carrier put his hand down and said, "Bridge, be small." And in that moment, the evil one tumbled, crying, into the river and was whisked away, drowned. And Ball Carrier took that wonderful bridge, put it back underneath his right arm, and began walking. And forgetting to call on the Manados, he knew not where he was going. And he traveled for a time, until he grew tired, so tired from his ordeals, he found a tree surrounded by grass, and he lay down, putting his head on a soft portion of the greenery that was there, and he went to sleep. And he slept the sleep of the dead. And this is where we will leave him